Hello, welcome to Module 4, Study Startup Part 2. In this Part 2 lecture, we're going to focus on database testing and entry instructions. We'll begin with an overview of common setup activities. Next, we're going to discuss the difference between validation, verification, and testing. This will take us into testing activities and principles, and we'll end with data entry instructions. In your textbook, Chapter 5, Preparing to Receive Data, Proska lists some common study startup tasks for both paper-based and EDC studies. Proska correctly points out that you have more time for setup activities in paper-based trials. When you're using a paper CRF, the database doesn't have to be operational at the same time that the patients begin enrollment. The sites can enroll patients and record data on the paper CRF, and that CRF can be stored until the database is released for entry. But with EDC trials, the database really needs to be up and usable by the time the first patient's enrolled. The takeaway here is that in EDC trials, you can't count on lag time between the start of enrollment and the release of the database. The database needs to be ready when the patients are enrolling. Proska also has a nice discussion in the text of basic setup activities for EDC and paper trials. I've listed some of the highlights on this slide. Here's one of those concepts I'm going to repeat throughout the course. The entry instructions need to be in place before the database is open for entry. Let's talk about validation, verification, and user testing, because these terms and concepts tend to be confused. It's important that you understand the difference between validation, verification, and end-user testing. According to the IEEE Standard Glossary of Software Engineering Terminology, validation is the process of evaluating a system or component during or at the end of the development process to determine whether it satisfies specified requirements. So validation demonstrates that the system is operational and that the software conforms to the requirements that were defined at the beginning of the software development lifecycle. Did we build the thing right? Verification, on the other hand, is the process of evaluating a system or component to determine whether the products of a given development phase satisfy the conditions imposed at the start of that phase. So, in other words, verification is proving that your output conforms to your input. Did we build the thing right? User acceptance testing, or UAT, is the last phase of the software testing process. During UAT, actual software users, like data entry people, test the software to make sure it can handle required tasks in real-world scenarios according to specifications. So UAT is the final, typically, procedure done before you release a new software. It's also known as beta testing, application testing, or simply end-user testing. Now, regulations and GCP require that software systems used in clinical trials be validated and verified. But as entry-level data managers, it's unlikely you'd be responsible for either validation and verification. You should know that it's required and understand the basic flow of the process, though. On the other hand, it's very likely you'll be involved in end-user testing or in simple verification tasks. So data management creates and uses a lot of products such as databases, status reports, QC listings, and edit checks. All of these will need to be tested. So you need to understand the basic purpose and principle of testing. What are testing activities? What do you actually test? Well, the list could be endless. Your company should have an SOP on testing to guide you. Make sure you're aware of and follow any SOPs on testing. But as a general rule of thumb, you want to test anything you're going to use to create, manage, or manipulate the data. So we always test the database. But we also need to test the edit checks we use to review the data, and even the status reports we're going to use to monitor study metrics. Personally, I think you should always test any deliverable. And a deliverable is something you are providing to another group or company. For example, if you're contracted to deliver data sets to the sponsor on a monthly basis, test that output to make sure the data sets include all the required data and that the format therein can be downloaded and used by the recipient. If you're sending a missing pages listing to the site, Check to make sure it only includes pages that are actually missing. For example, if the patient terminated at visit 2, the pages for visits 3 through 8 aren't really missing, even if you didn't receive them. They're just no longer expected. These are the sorts of things that you're going to find when you test that output. How do we test? Well, essentially, your goal is to ensure that the software or process you're testing is working as it should. So one way to do this is to review the specifications that were used to create it. Then create mock data or identify live or real data that meets that specification criteria. Pop it into whatever you're working with, get a printout or listing of the results, review it for errors, provide feedback to the programmer on those errors, review corrected output, and then document the entire process. Your readings from the textbook have really nice information on additional checks and principles. I'm going to cover just a few of the highlights here. Remember, the goal is to determine that the data was stored in a format that's going to allow it to be analyzed. So, in addition to testing to see if you can enter the data, you have to make sure it's being stored correctly. Are the vital signs data being stored as text or numbers? If a value is 5 digits, are all those digits actually being saved in the database, or are some of them being truncated or deleted? I once worked on a study where the programmer had accidentally limited the size of the file. Every day we entered data into a file, and each night the program deleted all the data over that limit. It took us a week to figure out why our data was disappearing. So you want to make sure your data is being stored the way you think it's going to be stored. We're going to start talking about the document control and data entry instructions now, and I want to insert a little reminder here that project-specific instructions need to be in place before you begin the task. So make sure you have the appropriate signatures or approvals that are required by SOP or by contract, and document that the training on these instructions occurred. I'm not going to discuss document control in depth in this course, in part because we're not going to be utilizing it in the REDCap EDC system. But I want to point out a few things about document control. First, it will differ from organization to organization. In some places, a central document control group handles all study documents. In other places, each functional area has its own aspect or version of document control. For this lecture, we'll look at document control only as it relates to data management. Document control and data management typically refers to tracking and storing case report form or other patient or source data. It may also pertain to project communication and project-specific documents and instructions. We'll narrow our focus to CRF and patient data. CRF and patient data must be stored in an access-controlled and fire-safe environment. Large companies usually have massive archives with humidity control and fire suppression systems. Many use automated tracking systems, such as a barcoding system, to record the movement of documents into and out of the archives. Small companies might simply store the documents in a fireproof safe or locking file cabinet and maintain a written record of who took a document in or out. This record has to say when the document left, when it came back, and who had it. Now it's time for the entry instructions. Let's start with when, and when is prior to beginning data entry. The basic data entry instructions have to be created and approved before you start entering data. It's almost a certainty that you're going to need to change the instructions as the study progresses. You will find and learn things that need to cause an update in the instructions. So make sure you document each change or update the version number, and then distribute the new version to all the team members. In the next few slides, we'll discuss what actually goes into those data entry instructions. Before we start writing our entry instructions, we need to be thinking about how we are going to actually get the data into the database. So what do I mean by that? Well, first, data entry is simply the process of transferring or transcribing data into a database. Your textbook often uses the terms data entry and data transcription to describe this process. Data entry can be performed by a person or by an electronic or digital process, such as using optical character recognition. The best choice for transcribing the data will be dictated by the needs of the study and the complexity of the data. There's no one-size-fits-all approach. When we have people transcribing or entering the data, we also need to decide the type of data entry flow they will use. Generally, this means choosing between single or double passes for data entry. Single passes are not that common. Occasionally, the simplicity of the data or the strength of the cross-checks on the data make it feasible to enter the data a single time and get a desirable error rate. EDC data is actually an example of single data entry. In order, though, to reduce transcription errors and get an acceptable error rate, most companies using paper-based CRFs are going to choose to utilize some form of double data entry. Double data entry means that the data is entered twice by two different entry operators. Again, there are some different flavors of double data entry. It can be heads down, heads up, blinded, or require a third-party resolution. So let's take a look at the heads up version. In this scenario, the second data entry operator is typically a senior staff member. They're expected to have significant experience and judgment. The second operator either sees all the data entered by the first operator or is shown only entries that are different between the two. And the second operator is able to review the differences, determine which version should be saved, and basically adjudicate it. This is often referred to as heads-up data entry. In another scenario, neither data entry operator can see what the other person entered. This is considered heads-down or blinded data entry. Both versions are stored and a list of the differences between the two is produced. That list is reviewed by yet a third person who determines which version should be saved. The advantage to blinded data entry or heads down is that the data is entered as quickly as possible and you avoid having the entry operator stop to figure out the issues with the data. They just type in what they see. Sometimes we decide to use what we call visual verification. Typically this is just for text fields. Instead of trying to duplicate every keystroke for a free text comment, the second operator will visually compare what was entered by the first operator and approve the entry if it matches the source document enough. I'm sorry if this image is a little fuzzy, but I think it does a great job of capturing the cascade of choices you can make about the flow of data through the entry and review process. So I wanted to include it in this lecture. This particular chart is produced by the Society of Clinical Data Management. After we decide on our data entry flow, single pass, double pass, blinded, heads down, heads up, we need to establish how closely the database has to match the CRF. On the surface that seems simple. They should match exactly, right? But the reality is that in many cases it's not desirable or necessary to have an exact match. Why? Because creating quality data fit for the purpose of your analysis may not require an exact match, and getting it can be very time-consuming and not worth the effort. Remember in Module 1, we discussed the concepts of accurate and quality data? We noted that not all data is critical, and that accuracy and quality needs to be considered in the context of fitness for purpose. Is it necessary for every character and space in a common medication name recorded on a CRF be replicated in the database? Or does the name only need to be recognizable for coding purposes? Keep in mind, sometimes the site staff make entry errors or transcription errors themselves, such as recording aspirin as aspirin with an extra R. Do we really need to query the site to change that text? Or can we establish a rule or convention for correcting or ignoring discrepancies that don't substantially change the meaning of the data? In many cases, we might decide it doesn't improve the accuracy and quality of the data to match the CRF exactly. So instead, we get that convention, rule, or policy documented in the entry instructions, such as allowing standard notations like kg for kilogram, or abbreviations such as October as OCT. Another thing you need to think about is legible data. It's a very common problem with paper CRFs. How are you going to handle it? Do you query the site, or can you have an experienced data review or data entry operator make a best guess and enter it? And then do those guesses have to be sent back to the site for approval? Again, you ask yourself, is this going to change critical data? Is it going to have an impact on the actual analysis? For example, an open text field on a medical history form may not need the same level of review as a critical data, like an adverse event text field. What is important is to establish a policy for how you're going to handle these situations. Document that policy and then make sure your data entry staff are using. What other content needs to be included in your entry instructions? Well, the entry instructions should contain basic information on how to access and log into the system. There should also be contact information that tells the site or data entry staff who to contact if the system goes down or they encounter other problems with it. The instructions should detail all the conventions, policies, and rules that the data entry operators are expected to follow. Can they correct obvious misspellings? Can they enter abbreviations for units? Some forms and fields may have a unique set of rules, such as an approval to verify visually comment text on the physical exam form, but not on the adverse event form, just like we discussed earlier. All of these conventions and rules need to be documented in the data entry instructions. In part one, we talked about training the team on the overview of the entire project, but we also want to make sure we train the team on using the database. And it can occur on several different levels. I always like to see a database demo. This is different from testing. After the database has been released from testing, project team members across all functions can attend a demo where they watch someone enter a mock patient, and it's a nice way to make sure the team members understand what you'll be doing in CDM or at the site. But each person who will be entering the data needs to be trained in depth on the process of entering it. That's different from a demo. Some companies use the demo to conduct this training, but most of them like to have each data entry operator enter a test or live patient and then have that entry reviewed by an experienced team member so they can be sure the data entry operators actually know how to enter the data. Whatever approach you take, it's important to document that the training has occurred. Starting in Module 5, we're going to perform data entry activities in our REDCap system. We'll be using several different approaches to teaching you how to enter data using REDCap. First, REDCap contains a lovely set of generic videos and training documents on key functions such as data entry and query resolution. Feel free to watch these videos and read those documents. They're very fun. But I'll also create a series of short videos that show you how to log into our version of REDCap and perform entry for each unique form in our mock trial. These videos will be created using Screencast-O-Matic. Basic Screencast-O-Matic is available as a free download. I'll post a link to test a video through YouTube. Please download Basic Screencast-O-Matic yourself too, and check to make sure you can play the video either through Screencast-O-Matic or through YouTube. Finally, I'll create a very basic set of written data entry instructions, which I'll post with the actual Module 5 assignment. You'll actually have 3 assignments for this module. 2 are individual, and the third is a group assignment. As an individual, you need to test your ability to view that Screencast-O-Matic video. You also are going to be receiving an email telling you that you have a REDCap user account. You need to set your new REDCap password and test log into REDCap. If you can't get into REDCap, you need to let me know by September 24th. As a group, you're going to need to review the protocol, synopsis, the scope of work, Appendix A and Appendix C in the text. Using those, I want you to identify at least 5 items or activities that would need to be addressed in a data management plan. Create a timeline that includes at least 10 events. 5 of those events need to link back to the data management plan. For example, if you're going to receive data sets of IVRS, patient diary data, you also need an item in the DMP which documents handling the IVRS data so that the two are linked.